we go. So the Bill of Rights is really important to bring into your classroom because I think that the charters of freedom, like the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, are the essential building blocks of civic life. And so schools are where that construction of the future voters' sensibility have to take place. And so your classroom is a really important place. It's really the only place where kids are going to learn about the big ideas, which are the heart of our national experience. And, you know, if they're going to be prepared to be the informed and active voters of tomorrow, it will be because of things that they learned and discussed in your class. So I want to give you some ideas about the Bill of Rights that can help you engage kids in active learning and discussion about it. I'm going to see if I can get my slide to advance here. There we go. So I work at the National Archives. And as you know, the National Archives is the federal agency that it was created to preserve and make available the records of government under the Constitution. We have a lot of records because we've been around since the 1930s, gathering the records that government officials have been creating since the 1780s. So we have 14 billion records that document the legacy of government by the people under the Constitution, and many, like a few million of them, are available to you online. So we are like a place where you can come and research, and we've got just like every kind of record you could imagine in vast number. But it's also a great place to go to get things to bring into your classroom if you want primary sources to teach with. And so come to our website at archives.gov, and you will find a search box that will give you access to our online catalog. We have a smaller, a kind of subset, I guess today you would say it's a curated version of our catalog at docsteach.org, which also has a lot of teaching materials that you could bring into your classroom. So I urge you to go in, if you haven't already used DocsTeach, go in and take a look around and see if there are things there that you could use to engage your kids. The National Archives is a big federal agency, and it has different divisions, and the division I work for has the records of Congress. So it's called the Center for Legislative Archives, and we have, you know, the records of the House and the Senate going back to 1789, and what we want to do with those lessons is conduct outreach that helps people understand what Congress does and why it matters. And we have a website where you can get a whole lot of resources that we've created using the records of Congress to enable students to understand representative government. So it's very similar to the National Archives address. It's archives.gov/legislative, as you might expect. And when you get there, you'll see a resources tab, and I'll show you that on the next slide. But before we go there, I just want to talk about the quantities of things that we have. We have a digital app that I'm going to show you tonight. We have 6 ebooks, 3 of which are made with political cartoons that you might find interesting to teach with. And we have 48 different lesson plans. So there's lots of things there that you can use. Think of it as this big buffet and just go in and shop around. And this is what the landing page looks like when you get to our website, and you can see that if you follow the Educational Resources tab, it's all right in front of you. You can see lesson plans on the fundamental principles of government, Congress and history, and how Congress works. And over on the right, you can see the link that'll take you to the app I'm going to be showing you in a few minutes, but also the link that will take you to the ebooks I just mentioned. So it's archives.gov/legislative, then follow the Educational Resources tab to get to all this good stuff. This is what learning looks like in the lessons that we create about Congress. We try to make big ideas in civics and history sticky. What that means is we want to help kids to form enduring understandings about the big ideas of civic life that are going to help them be tomorrow's active and informed voters. So you see the hands of kids here who are using one of our lessons, which is called What Congress Does and Why It Matters. And we feel that active learning, where learning is a social experience, working with primary sources is critically important in having kids form enduring understandings about our civic life. We also try to ground everything we do in standards. And so, as you know, we take the TEKS very seriously. And I'm going to talk about some of the TEKS that the materials I share with you today will help you teach. So in number 15, under government, they specify that the student understands American beliefs, principles, or beliefs and principles, I should say, reflected in important historic documents. The student is expected to identify the influence from historic documents on the U.S. system of government. I'm going to help you do that with reference to the Bill of Rights. But the second part of that point, well, the third part, point C, the student is expected to identify colonial grievances listed in the Declaration of Independence and explain how these grievances were addressed in the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Well, that's a tall order, especially for kids who are, maybe like in middle school. So we made a lesson to make studying the Constitution kid-friendly. And I put the address to it at the bottom of this slide. So you get like a twofer tonight. I'm going to talk explicitly about teaching the Bill of Rights. But after I finish, I want you to go check out this other lesson on teaching the Constitution. One of the activities in that lesson involves having the kids make a map of the big ideas in the Constitution. And you'll see, it's kind of the idea where you take a big abstract document and you make it understandable by making it visible, give them the landscape of ideas. So between that lesson and what I'm going to show you here, I think you've got a pair of things that will help you honor this aspect of the TEKS, okay? Now, with respect to government, they want the student to understand the purpose of changing the U.S. Constitution and the impact of amendments on American society. The student is expected to summarize the purposes for amending the Constitution and describe the impact of the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. We're going to make reference to the 14th Amendment at the very end of this presentation. There have been 11,000 proposed amendments to the U.S. Constitution over the years. Only 27 of them have been ratified, of course, but 11,000 have been proposed. So to say that you're going to teach the kids the purposes for amending the U.S. Constitution is really asking a lot. There were 11,000 different things that people wanted to achieve, but I think that the process of amending the Constitution is important, and I will talk with you a little bit about the purpose that was behind the first 10 amendments. In TEKS number 17, they want the student to understand the dynamic nature of the powers of the national government and state governments in a federal system. The student is expected to analyze the arguments of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, including those of Alexander Hamilton, Patrick Henry, James Madison, and George Mason. Well, I got you covered on this one. I'm going to show you a really easy way to bring specific arguments from the Federalists and Anti-Federalists into your classroom, okay? Specific little snips from different things that are about a sentence long that will enable the kids to wrestle with the big ideas without getting lost in really difficult antique documents. And then finally, the TEKS would like the student to understand the rights and responsibilities of citizens of the United States, and they expect them to summarize the rights guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. Again, I've got an activity that will go after that explicitly. So let's get into this. Students face three challenges when studying the Bill of Rights. First, understanding the context of law in which rights exist. Okay, in order to study the Bill of Rights, you have to understand a little bit about the political philosophy that created it or that fed into it. Secondly, and I think this is actually the hardest thing a kid has to do, you have to define what exactly a right is. It's a very difficult thing to define. And, it's asking a kid to do it without some kind of guidance is really wishful thinking. And thirdly, taking those first two bullets and putting them together, then you can use that understanding to actually read the Bill of Rights. something that most adults have not done. And so I think we're going to prepare the next generation to be better informed about it by following the steps that we're going to follow here tonight. First, we have to talk about rights within the context of the political philosophy that fed into the Bill of Rights. Okay, kids might come into your classroom thinking that a right is a kind of entitlement. It's something that they are always and absolutely able to do, able to not have to do. And so, it has those two dimensions. Well, let's go back to John Locke, who in the second treatise on civil government talked about rights in a context that I think is short and useful. John Locke said, where there is no law, there is no freedom. And then he goes on to explain what he means by saying, where there is no law, there is no freedom. For liberty is to be free from restraint and violence from others, which cannot be where there is no law. But freedom is not, as we are told, a liberty for every man to do what he wishes, but a liberty to dispose and order as he wishes his person, actions, possessions, and his whole property within the allowance of those laws under which he is, and therein not to be subject to the arbitrary will of another, but freely follow his own. So you can see that this idea of liberty and freedom can only take place within the context of a civil society based on law. And within an ordered society based on the rule of law, a person can make choices within the network of laws in which they live, and that set of choices equals freedom. And the ability to exercise liberty and not be, to live your life, let's say, and not be under the arbitrary control of another, that's what freedom is. So if you think about freedom in that context, that helps you think about, okay, so within that cloud of words, what is a right? Well, a right is something that people have been struggling with for a long time. How do you define it? And your kids are going to struggle. So I've got an idea. Instead of giving them an answer, why don't you help them to generate a definition? When I mentioned teaching about the Constitution, I said that our approach was to help them by making them take a big abstract document and to create a visual model of it. So with this problem of defining a right, it is serious adult level work. So how do you bring it into the classroom with middle school age kids? Get them to think about that society in which they live. As John Locke said, rights and liberty exist within the context of a community. So the community of the classroom is where the kids spend most of their teenage years. They spend more time with you than they do with their parents, right? And so within that community of learners, you could think about 4 different big entities, and then they overlap, okay? Student rights, student limits, teachers' rights, and teachers' limits. And the whole point is to make this social, is to get kids talking to each other about the rights that they have within your classroom. Because by creating a list of things that they say are rights, they are working toward a definition of what a right is, okay, by looking at the common features of the things they put on their list. I'll show you a few examples. Students have a right to learn, whereas teachers have a right to teach. Students are limited because the student can't interfere with the learning of another. And a teacher is limited because the teacher must teach all the students. Now, both teachers and students have a right to safety. And both teachers and students are limited in that they can't be cruel to other people within the class. Um, so what I'd like you to do is just take a minute, look at this diagram, and in the chat box, I'd like you to just add a couple of ideas about rights that students have within the classroom where you teach, where those kids, the community where those kids spend their time. What are a couple of rights that kids have? Thank you. A right to be heard and to share their ideas. And I think that's a really important right. Right to ask questions. I love that one. Yeah. And they both have, oh, I love it. They both have the right to be respected. Okay. Now, what does the teacher have in terms of rights? So take a moment and in the chat box, please give me a few examples. So, you know, what you can do is you can generate uh, a sense of like, what is this community like that we share every day? The right to adjust instruction and policies based on class culture. Yeah, and you're anticipating what I was thinking, and I thank you for that comment because I was thinking you're sort of making an intentional culture out of your class by doing a simple activity like this. You're saying to the kids, look, this isn't just like this arbitrary thing where we all happen to be in the same place at the same time, and I'm going to cram your heads with ideas. I mean, I'm going to do that, but this is also this community where we spend time together. And how should we treat each other? How should we work together? So, yeah, I mean, as Joyce points out, you have the right to keep order as a teacher so that everybody's able to learn. That's a really important part of being a teacher. And you do that like, yeah, through the procedures that you create and so on. But getting kids to be conscious of this is a way to get them to define what are rights within a civil society and how are rights and limits balanced. And I think that, this prepares them to be able to understand what folks were doing in the first Congress and in the ratifying conventions that preceded it, because what they were doing there when they talked about possibly amending the Constitution to include a Bill of Rights, and then when they actually were forming a Bill of Rights, is thinking about rights and limits within a civil society. It's the same operation. It's the same kind of thinking, just on a different scale. So getting kids to do that and to bring in a little more political philosophy, if you are a Machiavellian, you could then, of course, use the thing that the kids have created with you to create a kind of a constitution or a set of rules or understandings for your classroom, kind of a Bill of Rights. And so anyway, again, it's taking the challenge of defining a very abstract thing, and instead of giving kids an answer, in fact, to do the opposite and ask them to work together to generate some ideas that could help them internalize a definition, because that definition that they form together is going to be more of an enduring understanding. Okay, you've done this. You've had them think about what rights are. And now you're ready to look at the actual Bill of Rights. And this is an activity that we engage. We have these direct to classroom programs, which are free. And it's a virtual meeting where a National Archives educator will come to your class. And one of the programs is on the Bill of Rights. And I put the title of it at the bottom. I put where to find out more about it at the bottom of this slide, archives.gov, education/civic ed. But the actual text of the Bill of Rights is the next step, because, okay, now that you've been theoretical, Now you have to say, okay, but how does that relate to this charter that we're supposed to understand? So simple activity, what we do is we print a transcript of the Bill of Rights and we instruct the kids to work again in small teams, pairs or 3 kids, because the whole point is for them to be social, because kids learn when they are social, as you know. So they're going to highlight in orange or underline phrases that show limits on what the federal government can do. And then they're going to highlight in green or circle phrases shown that indicate protected rights. And then they're going to draw from this work to create a table of rights. And then they're going to answer some reflection questions. So we're going to go through and we're going to do a closed textual analysis of the actual Bill of Rights. And we're going to find out what does it really say. But by, again, using annotations on the text, we're going to try to read more carefully, and we're going to try to think about, what's in front of us. So when you do this operation, you quickly find that, as in our Venn diagram, you had the balance of rights and limits. Well, the Bill of Rights itself is a balance of rights and limits. Many of the amendments are not about the rights of the people, but they are limits on government. Ironically, when you limit the government, of course, you protect rights of the people, but the way you express it is different. So if we look at Amendment 1, for example, people will maybe sometimes tell you, if they're thinking just off the cuff, the Bill of Rights was created to respect an individual's freedom of worship. And you say, okay, that might be how we generally think of it, but let's look at the actual language. And if you look at it, you say, okay, if this is a limit, we're going to color it in orange or underline it. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. We'll stop there. Because up till that point, what we've done is explicitly put limits on the power of government. We're saying Congress shall not do these things. By extension, when Congress is unable to do those things, then people do have certain protections. But the language in Amendment 1 is on limiting the power of government. Now, then it goes into, if you notice after the semicolon, they talk about, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So in the expression of language in Amendment 1, you have a balance between a limit on government and a protected right of the people. If you look at Amendment 2, and this we'll discuss later, but in here, they're talking about a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of the state. And I always put in the word therefore, but it's not there. And the Supreme Court would disagree with me. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But you notice the way that this is stated, it's a right of the people that's protected. Now, I could go on and use all our time just going through the different amendments, but I just am going to take you on a quick journey and recommend that, you come back and you'll have this slideshow, so you could go in and consider whether you wish to engage your kids in this activity, and you would have a sort of a cheat sheet because you would have my slides. So Amendment 4, the right of the people to be secure. You notice it's a right and it's protected. Shall it's going to be protected against unreasonable searches and seizures. And then you notice it switches to a restraint on government. That right shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue, but upon probable cause, etc. And if you go to the Fifth Amendment, it's a series of limits on government. And notice the Sixth Amendment is like the opposite. It's a series of protected rights. Well, what I hope by showing contrasts like this you can do is get the kids to say, well, what are the elements of these contrasts? And how do 5 and 6 kind of work if you put them next to each other? What are we saying? We're saying that in Amendment 5, no person shall have to answer for a capital or infamous crime unless on presentment of a grand jury. Nor shall any person be subject to the same offense to twice be put in jeopardy, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And so, explicit limits on what government can do. And in 6, you've got these explicit protections. And so, you go through the Bill of Rights in a different way if you're taking it apart this way. And I think it's this taking it apart in a social context that helps them understand kind of the big ideas of government here, but it also gets them to understand exactly what's in the Bill of Rights. And so we've got Amendment 7, where we talk about the right of a trial by jury, and Amendment 8, where we talk that wonderful one about cruel and unusual punishment, which I think is kind of bloodthirsty and kids kind of like. But if we go on to the last 2 that I've listed here, you'll notice that Amendments 9 and 10 are limits on government. And, one is about the unspecified rights, and the Article 10 is about the relationship of the federal government and states. So in those, you have, a different set of things from the court-based legal rights that were talked about, in 4, 5, 6, and 7. And so the Bill of Rights is not just one thing. It's not just a list of, 10 protections that Moses carried down from Mount Sinai, but instead it's this negotiated list of a balance of limits and protections that really, if you look at it in that light, defines the border between the individual and the government, and the federal government and the state governments. So it's quite an interesting construction. And we're going to look historically at where that construction came from in a few minutes. But first, I think I want to show you this so that we know what's in that document that we're wrestling with. Well, when the kids have done this color coding, then they extract from it 2 columns, the rights of the people and the limits on the federal government. So let's go look at what you get. The people can assemble, petition the government, keep and bear arms, have a speedy public trial with a jury of one's peers, be secure in houses, papers, and effects from unreasonable search and seizure, have a lawyer represent them in a trial. And there's more. Be informed of the specific nature and cause of accusations, be confronted by witnesses in a criminal trial, and confront witnesses, compel defense witnesses to appear, have a trial by jury in civil cases, and know that the facts established by a jury cannot be re-examined except according to common law. The government cannot establish religion or prohibit religious practice, limit freedom of speech or the press, station soldiers in people's houses, search people or seize property without a warrant based on probable cause and a sworn oath, hold people for a crime without bringing charges from a grand jury, deprive people of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, try people twice for the same offense, take private property without just compensation, convict people accused of a crime without a fair trial, inflict cruel and unusual punishments, impose excessive bail or fines, say these are the only rights you have, or take powers that belong to the states or the people. So again, you've got now an explicit set of the powers and the limits. And I think by working through this operation, your kids become better informed about the nature of the Bill of Rights. So in that TEK where they want you to have the kids learn what does the Bill of Rights say, perhaps this is a kid-friendly social way to get to that end. So then having done that, you can answer some reflection questions. And I like this first one because I thought of it. But anyway, whose rights are protected in the Bill of Rights? And a kid will want to tell you, oh, the rights of the individual. Well, don't be so fast. Let's think about it. What did it say? And in several, they do talk about the rights of the people. But that's not the case in all of them. There's a lot going on in there. In Amendments 1, 2, 4, 9, and 10, they talk about the rights of the people. But in Amendments 3 and 5, they talk about protecting the rights of property owners. And in 5 and 6, they talk about persons accused of crimes. So whose rights are protected? Well, it's an answer that, you have to look at more closely to get to the bottom of. And I think that it could be the start of a kid finding this kind of interesting. Well, then you have a couple of questions that are wide open, and the whole point is to get kids just to take a side, make a hypothesis, and support it. What are the three most important limits on government and the Bill of Rights? And the whole point is to make them defend what they choose. How do the limits on government also protect rights? And I just spoke about that a minute ago, how like one is a mirror image of the other. If you protect the rights of the people, you of course limit what the government can do, and vice versa. How does the language from the Bill of Rights provide a means for responding to rights violations? And in our program with direct to classroom program, we use some primary sources, like an example from the Korematsu case to show how Fred Korematsu drew from the Fourth Amendment and the Sixth Amendment in his challenge of his detention. And in the Gideon versus Wainwright case, how Clarence Gideon used the Bill of Rights in his appeal when he was arrested for burglary back in Florida in the 1960s, and successfully appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. Okay, so that was kind of what's a right and what rights are in the Bill of Rights. Now we're going to put on our history hats, because they also want you to know where the Bill of Rights originated. So the first thing we're going to talk about is that Federalist, anti-Federalist debate that they want the kids to know about. Is there a short, efficient, kid-friendly way to get into that? You could have them read the Federalist Papers, but I wouldn't recommend it. So we're going to talk first about where you can get into this debate. So when we talk about the Federalist, anti-Federalist debate, what we're talking about are debates that happened in various state ratifying conventions that were held between December of 1787 and July of 1788. So it's like a 6-month period. And at first, several states ratified the new Constitution without any great discussion. But over time, as the debate went on, states were seeing more and more elaborate calls for amendments to the Constitution. People just wanted to make changes to it. They were uncomfortable with it in various ways. And it was that set of debates that produced the Bill of Rights, because it's this debate that was between the people who wanted to keep the Constitution as it was, who were called Federalists, and those who wanted to change it, the Anti-Federalists. That was really the first great national debate. And the big challenge at that time was, okay, how can this new government created under the Constitution deal with this emerging debate? In many countries, that would have been, the end of the government. There would have been shooting and armed revolution as the two factions fought it out. The fact that the United States was able to manage this debate and bring it to a productive conclusion through the Congress, through Article 5 of the Constitution, was really the reason, we can say, yeah, our government is resilient and can serve as a forum for big national issues, because this was the precedent-setting experience. So we're going to draw from that experience and talk about what was some of the ideas that people were debating. And we've got an app for this and a way for you to bring it into your classroom quite easily. The app is called Congress Creates the Bill of Rights, and it's available at the address you see at the bottom of this slide. It's a free app that was created for the iPad about a decade ago, and now I know the iPad is not so common in the classroom. So we also have a PDF version of it. So if you go to that address, you'll see the PDF version, which you can open on anything. And I think that's the one you'll probably most likely use, but it's a pretty cool app. And you can see here the menu for it. So it's divided into 3 big parts. Get the background, which will give you the historical context for that debate I was just describing. Going inside the first Congress, and you've got ways to look at who was in Congress, what were some of the issues and positions, and then the document we're going to talk about later, the Senate markup of the proposed Bill of Rights, is in there. And then I'm going to show you this close-up on compromise, which is kind of a track changes version of where the First Amendment came from. And then there are 17 amendments in process. When you go to the menu, you won't find a big gold arrow pointing at that. I added that arrow because that's where you'll go to get the information about the Federalist, Anti-Federalist debate. And having done all these things, there are discussion questions in the third column that you could go to. And so I think, this is a big collection of data made in an easy to navigate format. I think there's something like 300 pages of information in this app, but the way it's organized, you can kind of tunnel down and get right to what you need. So for each of the amendments, James Madison gets up in the House and he proposes, 17 amendments that are going to reconcile Federalists and Anti-Federalists to the Constitution. And so we did a treatment on each of these 17 proposed amendments. They didn't all make it into the final Bill of Rights, which is what makes it interesting. But there are 17 of them. And for each one of them, you could go in and open up the information on that proposed amendment, and you can find out what were the ideas proposed by state ratifying conventions. Bing, there you are, presto. That is where you get information on the Federalist, Anti-Federalist debates in the language of the times and in short, like one sentence bullets that you can have the kids work with. So the second bit of information you could get about each of those 17 proposed amendments is like, okay, so in what language did James Madison express it? And then how was it changed when a House committee studied it? And then in what language did it pass the House? How was it approved or amended in the Senate? What did it go to a conference committee between the House and the Senate? And how did that change it? And what was the language in which it was sent to the states for ratification? And then in what language was it ratified by the states? So you could get the life process of each of the proposed amendments. And it's a lot of information. So looking at some of the Federalist, Anti-Federalist ideas that, were relevant to this discussion, this will be relevant to what we call the Ninth Amendment in our language, but I called it, because I took it from proposed Article 15, before it was winnowed down and became the Ninth. The Virginia Convention said there are certain natural rights of which men, when they form a social compact, cannot divest or deprive or divest their posterity, among which are the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. So, this gives you an idea of what the Anti-Federalists were saying, and you might wonder, where did they get this idea from, and where did it appear also? So you might show them how this same language 12 years earlier had appeared in George Mason's, he was the principal idea behind in Jefferson's Virginia Declaration of Rights, that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights. So we've gone from this sense of natural rights. Well, 12 years earlier, they were talking about inherent rights. When they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely, and it's the life, liberty, and property. And so, by getting the kids to compare these two statements, of course, you can teach them about what's the big fundamental idea and how are these texts different? Because a third text from just a month after the Virginia Declaration of Rights, Jefferson again is involved in creating, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator, which is a whole different origin of the rights, with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is a change from property. So by getting them to look at the three different versions of that language, you do two things. You can talk about close textual analysis, how words have agency and how you express big ideas, but also how the Virginia Convention fed this fundamental idea into the discussion, which yielded the Bill of Rights, okay? Here's another one, and this one I think is pretty provocative. The New York Convention of the Anti-Federalists there said that the powers of government may be reassumed by the people whensoever it shall become necessary to their happiness, that every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by the said Constitution clearly delegated to the Congress of the United States or to the departments of government therein remains to the people of the several states, or their respective state governments to whom they may have granted the same. And so again, you can see that one will become part of what we call the Ninth Amendment, Article 15, but also part of Article 16, Article 17, which we call the 10th Amendment. So again, two examples from the Anti-Federalist debate. This one takes us to the origins of the Second Amendment, which kids are inordinately fond of discussing. That the people have a right to keep and bear arms, that a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people trained to arms is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state, that standing armies in times of peace are dangerous to liberty and therefore ought to be avoided, that any person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms ought to be exempted upon payment of an equivalent to employ another to bear arms in his stead. And I'm going to show you the fifth proposed article that came up in Congress when we look at the document we're going to share in the sort of document part of this. And you'll see that the ideas that are in here feed into what gets winnowed down to be what we call the Second Amendment. But it's that idea of militia and arms and what's the balance between them. And that's, that's something that we've been debating about ever since. Well, okay, so then the second part of the origin of the Bill of Rights, how did Congress take all that set of proposals, over 200 proposed amendments from the ratifying conventions, and work with them? The Federalists in Congress said, we're not going to touch them, but James Madison persuaded everybody that they really needed to consider some moderate amendments. And so that's the process that we're now going to look at. And the document we'll look at together in the third part of this is the notes that Samuel Otis wrote down as the Senate debated. So again, if you want to get at this document and get at the arguments that created the Bill of Rights and the process of negotiation that crystallized it, go to the app, which I showed you a moment ago, and where you'll be is Senate markup, close-up on compromise, and the 17 amendments in process. We're going to look at the Senate markup, which you can see right here. And it's in the app, and it's in a really high-res scan, so you can really zoom in a lot. And when you do, you'll see the First Amendment, what we call the First Amendment, looks like this. It's 2 articles, and they're heavily written over. Well, if we could take that writing apart, we could understand where the First Amendment came from. And so I'm going to show you very quickly, because I'm mindful of time, a timeline that will walk us through the months of August and September 1789 and show you that the First Amendment was not just a good idea that Madison had one day, but it was actually the process, was the result of the legislative process in Congress. And so we start off, and when you go to the app, you'll see that on August 24th, we had 2 articles that were proposed. One was about religion and the freedom of conscience, and the other was about the freedom of speech. And what I'm going to show you through a track changes thing, it'll be too fast to really, look at it at the length it probably deserves, but is how these were shaped by Congress. On September 3rd, they took those 2 proposed amendments and they began to change them. And in the app, you can see what they did, and they changed the language on religion. First thing they did. Later that day, they're going to do something that I think is incredibly important, when what they do with the language of Article the 3rd, see up top, you've got a facsimile, then in the middle, you've got a transcript, and I'm showing you changes to that transcript in the form of track changes. You can see all that in the app. And then at the bottom is an explanation. So on September 3rd, later in the day, they crossed out the rights of conscience, nor shall the rights of conscience be infringed. And it begs the question of, so what are those rights? And you can see that they kept busy throughout the month of September, making changes, and they changed the language on religion again. And then they took the language on the freedoms of speech, press, and assembly, and they limited it by making it a restriction on Congress, instead of it just being a universal guarantee of a rather sweeping freedom. And you can see they make more changes as they're going along, and this thing's really becoming a mess now, because they're changing the language on religion again. And so you can get the kids to think about, why did they keep changing the language on religion? And how are they different, one version from another? And then finally, they came up with, this version that, okay, we're out of the woods, except that's not the First Amendment. So where did the First Amendment come from? And as our app will explain to you, they had a conference committee where James Madison very wisely told his colleagues to be sensible, and go back to the language that he had first proposed. So what I hope that you have seen in this is that the Bill of Rights was a historical creation, and it was the work of many people, and it was something that evolved over time, that it has roots in the 17th and even 16th centuries. And it's really in the 18th century when after the American Revolution, they begin debating about the limits of government, that it takes the form that we know. So what you want kids to understand, it's a process. It's a process that was fashioned by representative government. And just as fundamental rights were debated in the 1780s in the federal Congress, fundamental rights are debated there today. So it's really important that they use this historic example to consider their own role in future debates about fundamental rights. And finally, one of the questions that was not answered in the Bill of Rights debate in the 1780s and 90s is, to whom do the rights listed and protections apply? And very quickly, I'm going to show you something that I hope will help you, because the Bill of Rights was not taken seriously after it was written. It settled the big debate, and then everybody kind of forgot about it. The Bill of Rights really got new urgency when the 14th Amendment was ratified, and that was in 1868. And so all of a sudden, we've entered a whole new conversation about rights. And so if you're going to have your kids understand the Bill of Rights and think about what the Bill of Rights means, you want to think about the historical context, the John Locke, the Anti-Federalist Federalists, but you've also got to think about this second creation of America here, where we have a new republic formed by the adoption of the 14th Amendment, and to take a look at the language of the 14th Amendment with the kids and ask them to think about, what does this mean in terms of rights? And we're going to be having a webinar on that upcoming from the National Archives. So if you go to our website, you'll see an announcement about when that will be. And we'll be talking about how the 14th Amendment relates to the Bill of Rights. But for tonight, what I'd like to leave you with is the thought that National Archives is a very rich source of resources that you can take into the classroom. And I hope that what I've shared with you thus far in our time together gives you some ideas of useful things. And I'll stop sharing and be ready for any questions